The studio lights came on slowly, not all at once, but in layers. First the soft glow over the stage floor, then the sharper white beams above the band, and finally the warm wash that settled over the audience like a held breath. It was the kind of room where reputations were tested, where applause could lift a man higher than he'd ever dreamed or strip him bare in seconds. On this particular night, the producers were chasing speed. Not music, not wisdom, speed. They wanted spectacle, a moment that would race across newspapers and television screens by morning. And so they invited the man everyone had begun calling the world. As fast as professional, a performer whose reflexes were measured in hundredths of a second, whose reputation was built on humiliating challengers in front of cameras. His demonstrations were sharp, surgical, almost cruel. Coins vanished before the eye could blink. Cards snapped from decks like lightning strikes. Cigarettes appeared and disappeared with mechanical precision. And then there was Dean Martin. Dean had not asked to be part of this experiment. He was there because he always was, because when a show needed warmth, humor, or a sense of human ease, his name rose naturally to the top. Dean Martin didn't rush. He didn't perform tricks. He didn't chase astonishment, sang, joked, and smiled in ways that made people forget the clock existed at all. That contrast between speed and stillness was exactly what the producers wanted. Backstage, the fastest pro stretched his fingers as if preparing for a surgical operation. Every movement was efficient. Every breath measured. He had made a career out of exposing the slowness of others, turning hesitation into humiliation. In his world, delay was weakness. Tonight, he believed, the audience would witness the ultimate comparison. An old-school crooner versus modern precision, a relic versus a machine. Dean, meanwhile, sat comfortably in a chair near the band, chatting quietly with the trumpet player. He laughed easily, the sound loose and unforced. He wasn't warming up his hands or focusing his eyes. He wasn't rehearsing anything at all. He was simply present-tasking about the man's family, listening to stories about long nights on the road, nodding with genuine interest. If Dean felt any pressure, it didn't show. When the host called them out, the applause arrived in waves. The fastest pro stepped forward first, bowing slightly. Already wearing the confident half-smile of someone who expected victory before the contest had begun, the crowd knew him. They knew what he could do. They leaned forward, ready to be amazed. Then Dean walked out. No rush, no drama, just that familiar, unhurried stride. A small grin tugged at the corner of his mouth, as though he already understood something no one else did. The host introduced them with exaggerated enthusiasm, setting up the contrast as clearly as possible. He spoke of reaction times measured in fractions of a second, of training regimes that push the human nervous system to its limit. Then he turned to Dean, smiling almost apologetically, and praised his charm, his voice, his legendary calm. The implication hung in the air. This was not Dean's arena. The fastest pro took control immediately, called for a volunteer, produced a deck of cards, and within moments had reduced the audience to gasps. Cards flew, hands blurred, results appeared before the cause could even be seen. Every success was punctuated by a glance toward, not openly hostile, but unmistakably dismissive. When the applause died down, he finally addressed him directly. "Mr. Martin," he said, his tone polite but edged with confidence, "they say timing is everything but speed. Speed decides who controls the moment." A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. Dean tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. Then he smiled. "Sounds exhausting," he replied lightly. More laughter this time, warmer, less sharp. The pro waved it off and turned to the host. "Let's do something simple. A reflex test. Nothing fancy." A small table was brought out. On it lay a single cigarette and a lighter. The fastest pro explained the challenge with clinical precision. He would drop the cigarette from shoulder height. Dean's task was to catch it before it hit the table. The crowd murmured. Everyone knew the outcome already. Gravity was unforgiving. Reflexes declined with age. The mathematics were cruel. The pro positioned himself, holding the cigarette between two fingers. He looked at Dean again, this time with a smile that didn't bother hiding its condescension. "Ready?" he asked. Dean leaned back slightly, hands resting loosely at his sides. He nodded. The cigarette fell. It was over before most people realized it had begun. The cigarette hit the table. Sharp tap. clean, uncaught. The fastest pro raised his hands immediately, basking in the reaction. Laughter broke out, some good-natured, some uncomfortable. The host tried to soften it with a joke, but the moment had already been claimed. Dean didn't flinch. He looked at the cigarette, then at the pro, then out at the audience. And then he chuckled, not nervously, not defensively, but with genuine amusement. Again, Dean asked. The pro hesitated just for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected that, but confidence carried him forward. "Of course," he said, "but I'll make it faster." He raised the cigarette again, this time a little higher. The audience leaned in. The band fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. The cigarette dropped. Once more, it struck the table untouched. Laughter followed, louder this time. Dean nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. "All right," he said calmly. "My turn." The host blinked. "Your turn." Dean reached for the cigarette and the lighter. He didn't rush. He didn't explain. He simply placed the cigarette between his fingers, then held it out toward the pro. "Hold this," he said. The fastest pro frowned, but took it. His grip was firm, precise. Dean then flicked the lighter, not lighting it, just testing the wheel, listening to the soft, familiar click. He looked up at the pro and met his eyes. "You're fast," Dean said, his voice gentle. No doubt about it. The compliment seemed to soften the room slightly. No. But speed isn't the same as timing. A few people laughed, unsure whether it was a joke. Dean gestured for the pro to drop the cigarette again, this time into the space between them. The pro obliged. What happened next would later be described in headlines, replayed in slow motion, and debated endlessly by people trying to explain it away. The cigarette fell. Dean's hand moved, but not toward the cigarette. Instead, in one smooth, almost lazy motion, he flicked the lighter upward. There was a soft click. Flame appeared, and the cigarette still falling passed directly through it. It lit midair. Dean reached out and caught it effortlessly, already burning as though gravity itself had paused to watch. The room went silent. No laughter, no applause. Just shock. The fastest pro stared at the cigarette in Dean's hand, his mouth slightly open. His rehearsed confidence evaporated, replaced by something unfamiliar: confusion. Dean took a gentle drag, exhaled slowly, and shrugged. "About 0.20 seconds, he said casually. "Give or take." The audience erupted. But the fastest pro didn't move. He was speechless. Because he had been beaten at speed, but because he had been outplayed at understanding. Dean hadn't tried to be faster. He had waited. He had allowed the moment to come to him. He had trusted experience over reflex. As the applause thundered around them, Dean turned slightly toward the pro and leaned in, his voice low enough that only the microphones barely caught it. "Fast hands are impressive," he said kindly. "But a calm mind sees the whole picture." The pro nodded slowly, still processing. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just on stage, but in the way the audience understood what they had witnessed. This was no trick. This was a lesson, and it was only the beginning. The applause did not fade the way applause usually does. It hung. It lingered in the air like smoke after an explosion, thick with disbelief and delayed understanding. People were clapping not just with their hands, but with their faces, wide eyes, parted lips, bodies leaning forward as if gravity itself had been rewritten on that stage. The cigarette still burned calmly between Dean Martin's fingers. That detail mattered more than anyone realized. Fire was chaos. Fire was movement. Fire was time-consuming matter. And yet there, it was proof that something impossible had happened in a space smaller than a heartbeat. The host tried to speak. His mouth opened. No sound came out. The fastest pro stood frozen, his hand still positioned where the cigarette had been. His brain was replaying the moment again and again, desperately searching for the missing frame, the error in perception, the trick angle, the illusion. But there was none. This wasn't sleight of hand. This was something else. Dean exhaled slowly, not for show, not to punctuate the moment, just because that's how he breathed. The smoke curled upward, lazy and unbothered, as if mocking the frantic calculations racing through the pro's mind. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host finally managed, his voice cracking slightly, I don't even know how to explain what we just saw." Dean smiled, small and unassuming. You don't have to, he said. They saw it. That was the difference. The fastest pro had built his career on explanation and breaking moments down into milliseconds. On naming the exact instant where others failed and he succeeded. He controlled the narrative by controlling the math Dean didn't explain. He trusted the room. And that unsettled the pro more than losing ever could. As the show cut to a brief musical interlude, cameras pulled back. Applause softened into chatter. The band resumed, but the rhythm felt off like everyone was still standing on the edge of something unresolved. Backstage, the fastest pro paced, not angrily, not dramatically, methodically. He replayed the drop in his head, the angle, the flame, the catch. He timed it. Instinctively, 0.20 seconds, maybe less. That wasn't the issue. He had reacted faster than that hundreds of times in his life. The problem was intent. Dean hadn't chased the cigarette, had invited it. That realization made the pro stop pacing. Across the room, Dean sat again, this time alone, a glass of water in his hand. He wasn't surrounded by assistants or producers. He wasn't soaking up praise, was simply watching the band pack up, nodding along to their quiet jokes. The pro approached slowly. For the first time that night, he did not lead with confidence. "Mr. Martin," he said. Dean looked up, immediately attentive. Yeah, there was no edge, no defensiveness, just openness. "I need to ask you something," the pro said. "And I need you to be honest." Dean gestured to the chair beside him. It's usually the easiest way. The pro sat. For a moment, neither spoke. The noise backstage filled the gap, cases snapping shut, footsteps, distant laughter. Life continuing, unaware that something fundamental had just cracked open. "You weren't faster than me," the pro said finally. Dean nodded. "No. You didn't outreak me." "Nope." "Then how did you do it?" Dean took a sip of water. He thought not. Because the answer was complicated, but because it mattered how it was given. "I stopped trying to win," he said. The pro frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "It will," Dean replied gently. "Just not yet." The pro leaned forward. "I've trained my whole life to be faster than the moment, to arrive before it fully exists." Dean smiled. "That's where you went wrong." The words weren't sharp, they weren't cruel, but they landed heavier than any insult could have. "You think the moment is something you attack?" Dean continued. "Something you conquer, something you beat." He tapped the side of the table lightly with one finger. "But moments aren't enemies, they're conversations." The pro stared at him, caught between irritation and curiosity. "A conversation," he repeated. "Yeah," Dean said. "You talked over it?" "I listened." The pro shook his head. "You're saying you waited?" "I'm saying I trusted," Dean replied. "Gravity, fire, my own hands. Years of watching how things fall, how people move, how time behaves when you don't rush it." He leaned back slightly. "Speed is loud," Dean added. "Timing is quiet." People forget that. The pro felt something shift uncomfortably in his chest. For years, he had been praised as unbeatable. Headlines called him mechanical, superhuman, untouchable. He had accepted those labels because they fed the story, because they protected him from ever having to sit in this kind of silence. But silence was where Dean lived. And suddenly, the pro realized he didn't know how to exist there. "You embarrassed me out there," he said quietly. Dean met his eyes. "No," he said. "You embarrassed your idea of yourself. That hurt more than if Dean had denied it. I never meant to mock you," the pro added. "The joke. Setup. That was the show, I know," Dean said. "And that's why I didn't take offense." The pro blinked. "Why not?" "Because if you'd needed to mock me," Dean replied, "you were already fighting something bigger than me, that landed hard." The pro looked away, jaw tight. "You think I'm insecure? I think you're human," Dean said simply. "And humans chase speed when they're afraid of stillness." The room felt smaller. "Come back tomorrow," the pro said suddenly. Dean raised an eyebrow. "Tomorrow?" "My training space," the pro continued. "No audience, no cameras, just you and me." Dean studied him for a long moment. "And then what?" Dean asked. The pro swallowed. "Then I want to see if what you did was real or if it was just luck dressed up as wisdom." Dean smiled, not amused, not offended, interested. "All right," he said. but on one condition. The pro looked up. Name it. Dean stood, placing the empty glass down carefully. No timers, he said. No measurements. No speed talk. The pro hesitated. It's just presence, Dean finished. If you can handle that. The fastest pro nodded slowly. I think, he said, that's exactly what I'm afraid of. Dean clapped him once on the shoulder, not hard, not patronizing. Good, he said. It means you're about to learn something. The next morning, before the sun had fully claimed the sky, the fastest pro stood alone in his training room. The walls were lined with tools cards, coins, metronomes, high-speed cameras, proof of a life spent slicing time thinner and thinner until nothing else mattered. When Dean walked in, unannounced and unhurried, the pro felt it immediately. This was not a challenge. This was an exposure. And for the first time in his career, the fastest man in the room wondered not how fast he could move, but what he had been missing by always moving first. The training room smelled faintly of metal and oil, not because anything was broken, but because everything inside it had been pushed to its limit. Springs wound tight, mechanisms calibrated down to fractions no human eye was meant to notice. High-speed cameras perched in the corners like silent judges, their lenses dark for now, waiting. The fastest pro stood in the center of the room, barefoot on the polished floor. The first time in years he had turned everything off. No timers, no monitors, no metronomes, ticking judgment into the air. This silence. When Dean Martin stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him, the pro felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Dean looked around with curiosity and not intimidation. He didn't comment on the equipment. He didn't ask questions. He simply observed, as if he were walking into a living room rather than a laboratory built to dominate time. You always train like this? Dean asked casually. The pro hesitated. With everything on? Yes, and without it. The pro shook his head. Never. Dean nodded. Makes sense. The answer unsettled him. Most people push back. They challenged. They argued philosophy. Dean simply accepted on somehow. That acceptance felt heavier than resistance. The pro cleared his throat. I want to recreate what you did last night. Dean smiled faintly. That's not possible. The pro frowned. Why not? Because you're trying to recreate an outcome, Dean replied, setting his coat on a chair. Not the state that allowed it. Silence returned. The pro crossed his arms. Then show me the state. Dean looked at him for a long moment, not evaluating, listening. Drop something, Dean said. The pro reached for a coin out of habit, then stopped himself. He placed it back and instead picked up a simple wooden match. He held it between his fingers. Whenever you're ready, Dean said. The pro released it. The match fell. Dean didn't move. It hit the floor. The pro let out a breath, half relieved, half confused. You missed. No, Dean said calmly. I chose not to act. The pro stiffened. Why? Because you weren't ready, Dean replied. And neither was I. That answer irritated him more than failure ever had. Again, the pro picked up the match, his movements sharper now, less composed. He dropped it without warning. This time Dean's hand moved. Fast, but not desperate. The match landed in his palm. Pro froze. You didn't rush, he said. But you didn't wait either. Dean nodded. That's the space. The space, the pro echoed. The moment between anticipation and reaction, Dean said. Where you're not guessing and you're not chasing, the pro swallowed. Entire career had been built on shrinking that space to nothing, and speed. The pro asked. Dean shrugged. Speed is just what happens when you stop fighting time. The pro stepped back, unsettled. He gestured toward the walls. All of this, he said, voice tight, is built to defeat hesitation. Dean looked at the equipment again this time, more carefully. In doing so, Dean said quietly, you taught yourself to fear stillness. The words landed like a crack in glass. The pro laughed sharply. Stillness gets you beaten. Dean met his eyes. Only if you think every moment is a race. The pro turned away, jaw clenched. For years, his identity had protected him. The fastest, the untouchable. The man no one could surprise. But last night, he had been surprised. Worse, he had been understood. You know why that cigarette moment broke you? Dean continued gently. The pro didn't answer. Because for the first time, Dean said, someone didn't try to outdo you. They let you finish being fast and then showed you something else existed. The pro's fists tightened. You didn't humiliate me, he said. You exposed me. Dean nodded. Exposure feels like humiliation when we've hidden too long. The room grew quiet again. The pro finally turned back. Do you know how many people I've embarrassed on stages like that? Dean didn't flinch. It's enough that you stopped seeing faces. That one hurt. The pro sat down heavily on a bench. His shoulders sagged not with exhaustion, but with something closer to grief. I thought speed made me safe, he admitted. Dean pulled a chair closer and sat across from him. Safe from what? The pro stared at the floor. Being ordinary. Dean smiled softly. Ordinary people don't master time. They suffer under it. The pro looked up, startled. You're not ordinary, Dean continued. You're just incomplete. That word echoed. Incomplete. Not broken. Not flawed. Incomplete. You can add something, Dean said. Or you can keep running. The pro exhaled shakily. And if I stop running? Dean leaned forward, voice low. You might finally feel the moment before it arrives. They sat there for a long time. It's no tests, no challenges, no demonstrations. It's just two men, one who had lived his life ahead of time and one who had learned to live inside it. Finally, the pro stood. I want to go back on stage, he said. Shh. Dean raised an eyebrow. Again, not to perform, the pro clarified. To speak? Dean studied him carefully. It takes more courage than speed. The pro nodded. I think I owe the audience something. Dean stood as well. Then don't explain, he said. Invite. That night under lights that once glorified dominance and mockery, the fastest pro returned not with tricks, not with challenges, but with a single sentence that stunned the room into silence. I spent my life outrunning moments, he said. And last night, I met a man who waited and arrived before me. All eyes turned to Dean. Dean didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply lifted his glass in quiet acknowledgement, as the real performance had already happened. And the slowest lesson was still unfolding. The stage looked different the second time. Same lights, same audience, same polished floor that had once amplified laughter and disbelief. But the energy had changed. People weren't leaning forward this time, hungry for spectacle. They were sitting back, quiet, alert like witnesses instead of spectators. Word had spread fast. Not just that something impressive had happened, but that something unsettling had occurred. Something that didn't fit neatly into applause clips or slow motion replays. The fastest pro stood alone at center stage. No props, no table, no cigarette. His hands were empty. That alone made the room uneasy. Took a breath not to prepare a trick, but to steady himself. Then he spoke. I've spent my life proving I was faster than everyone else. No jokes followed. No music swelled. The silence accepted his words without resistance. I measured myself in fractions of a second, he continued. I believed if I could move before others thought, I would never be overlooked, never be small. A few heads nodded. The audience understood more than he expected. He glanced to the side of the stage, where Dean Martin sat in a simple chair, hands folded, expression calm. Dean hadn't been announced. He hadn't been spotlighted. He was just there. And then, the pro said, voice tightening slightly, someone didn't try to beat me. A pause. He let me finish. The room held its breath. I mocked him, the pro admitted. I assumed speed meant superiority. I thought calm meant weakness. He shook his head slowly. I was wrong. The audience didn't clap. They listened. Last night I learned something terrifying, he went on. You can outrun people your whole life, and still be late to what matters. A ripple passed through the room, not applause, but recognition. He turned fully toward Dean now. You didn't humiliate me, the pro said clearly. You didn't trick me. You showed me a moment I'd been skipping my entire life. Dean inclined his head, almost imperceptibly. The host stepped forward cautiously. Would you like to demonstrate anything tonight? The pro smiled faintly. No. That answer shocked the room more than any stunt could have. But, he added, I'd like to ask something. He reached into his pocket and removed a coin plane, worn, unremarkable. He held it up between his fingers. Everyone here, he said, expects me to drop this and catch it faster than thought. A murmur of agreement. I won't. He walked to Dean and placed the coin gently in his palm. Instead, the pro said, turning back to the audience, I want you to watch what happens when no one is racing. Dean looked at the coin, then at the pro. You sure? Dean asked softly. The pro nodded. For the first time in my life. Dean stood. He didn't announce himself, didn't command attention, yet the room aligned around him instinctively, like iron filings drawn to a quiet force. Dean held the coin up not to display it, but to feel its weight. He closed his eyes briefly. The fastest pro noticed something, then something that hadn't registered before. Dean wasn't waiting for the moment. He was with it. Dean opened his eyes and let the coin rest on the edge of his fingers. He didn't drop it right away. He didn't look at the floor. He looked at the audience. At some point, Dean said gently, we all learned to move faster. People leaned in. We talk quicker, decide quicker, judge quicker. We think if we slow down, we'll disappear. The coin tipped slightly but didn't fall. But the truth is, Dean continued, slowing down is how you finally arrive. He released the coin. It fell. Dean didn't move. A gasp swept the room. The coin struck the floor and spun, ringing softly as it wobbled in place. Dean smiled. That, he said, is the sound of letting go. The fastest pro felt his throat tighten. There was no trick, no reveal, no impossible feat. Yet the audience erupted, not in shock, but in something deeper, relief. They weren't applauding skill. They were applauding permission. Permission to stop chasing. Permission to stop proving. Permission to stop measuring their worth in speed, productivity, dominance. Dean stepped back, returning to his chair. The pro stood alone again. But he felt different now, lighter, unarmored. I thought mastery meant control, the pro said into the hush. But what I saw was trust. He bowed not theatrically, not for show, genuinely, to Dean, to the moment, to the stillness he had feared. As the lights dimmed and the band began to play, people didn't rush for the exits. They lingered. They spoke softly. They carried something with them that wouldn't fit into headlines. Later that night, when reporters asked Dean how he'd done it, how he'd stunned the fastest man alive without trying to be faster, Dean laughed quietly. I didn't beat him, he said. I just didn't interrupt the moment. And somewhere backstage, the world's fastest pro sat alone, staring at his hands, not wondering how fast they could move anymore, but finally asking what they might feel if they didn't have to.